Good day, everyone. Today we go live on not just YouTube, it's a special occasion. We're going to continue the discussion with Jonathan MS Pearce and covering his book, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God. But we're going live on Twitter and Facebook as well today. These two other areas are uninterrupted, so I wanted to make sure as many people get to hear these interesting views. And before I sort of waffle on, let me introduce again Jonathan to the Critical Faculty Studio. Good day, Jonathan. How are you?
Hello. I'm back with my favourite Irish Egyptian Australian. I'm stoked to be here. So thank you for inviting me, and also Facebook and Twitter. So that's exciting.
Yeah. I thought not enough people stream over there, so I thought there might be different type of people that lurk about these sort of areas, and maybe few people are sick of YouTube and want to watch us elsewhere.
Everyone loves a lurker.
Exactly. Well, before we delve into the conversation, last conversation we talked about your book on Amazon. We've displayed the information, and I want, while I'm talking with you, I want you to, here's the book. And I want you to reference as well, because you've got a YouTube channel, Jonathan, right?
Yes. So I used to blog at Pathos Non-Religious before, as I've said before we were cancelled there, and I blogged under A Tippling Philosopher. So you can find me at A Tippling Philosopher on YouTube. That's my YouTube channel. And then I write for Only Sky, which is a non-religious broadcasting media company, and I write as a feature columnist there at Only Sky. So you can find me under the moniker A Tippling Philosopher or Jonathan MS Pearce there. So that's my YouTube channel. So trying to make waves in the world of YouTube.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm looking at it right now. Obviously, it seems like you're giving a lot more love to other channels other than yourself. You don't have the time, obviously, to cover.
Yes. So just like, it's great to get on other channels, but so many, so many videos I've already done and things I've still got to do. And a whole back catalogue of articles that I've written I need to discuss in my videos. So there's a lot still to do, but it's finding the time when you are sort of torn between all these different places and writing.
Yeah, for sure. I can understand. And while you're talking as well, I am going to try to share your blog.
Yeah, so it's a column at Only Sky, and so onlysky.media /J Pearce is where you can find all my writing. I'm writing about all sorts. It's not just stuff to do with like explicit atheism, but it's trying to be a media channel, a media organization that reports on general news, but through a secular lens. So actually at the moment, I'm doing quite a lot of UK based news, to almost a UK correspondent, but also doing my usual philosophical stuff in between. So there's a whole mix of stuff of politics, news, and philosophy and all that. So that's the main website, Only Sky. It's such a phenomenally awesome site, so varied in the topics that people write about, and there's so many great writers on there. I really do advise people hang out at Only Sky for a bit.
I can see Herman Mehta also.
Herman Mehta is there with us. We've got Phil Zuckerman, who's a famous sociologist of religion. Just absolutely tons of people that are really great writers.
This is brilliant. Right. So last time I think we stopped at, I love the way your book is sort of constructed against around the very beginning of the story. You follow the story from the very beginning and follow the trail every step of the way. And you kind of design arguments, or not design, like find really arguments and loopholes and holes in the story from the narrative itself. And
Yeah, well, so I start off by discussing what God is. So we talked about omnigod last time. So the most common feature of God that most people believe in features are all knowing, all powerful, and all loving. Taking that into account, divine foreknowledge, we take that as a given and say, right, what are the problems with these? Okay, so we start with that idea, and you can believe in different versions of God. Of course, you can. So the problem is you can't argue against every type of God, because every type of God has different characteristics depending on what the believer is. So I start with the classical theistic notion of God, what that I call omnigod, and we go, right, why bother creating at all? If you're that kind of God, why would you, and you have no needs and you're perfect, why would you create at all? Okay, that's out argument out of the way. Okay, now you have created, how would you design things, and is this the world we would expect, and so on. And so going through all these ideas from a design and creation point of view, and then looking at things like Adam and Eve in that context, and then going through these ideas, why do people believe, how is God fair, then we talk about morality, and so go through these different subjects. So by the end of the book there's 30 core arguments against the existence of God. And yeah.
And it makes complete sense. I mean, we're talking about probably 55 to 60% of the world's population covered under the Abrahamic faith. I think with almost 2.5 billion Christians, getting close to now 1.9 billion Muslims, and the Jews continue to be a small minority. I think they're always around the 15 million or so.
Yeah. A lot smaller faith than people actually imagine. But yeah, you take those major faiths into account, and yeah, you will find things like Calvinists who deny free will, and you will find open theists who might deny that God has full divine foreknowledge. But those are small, really quite relatively very small proportions of the overall number of believers. And so really I'm fairly confident that dealing with this kind of God, omnigod, is the most sensible way to approach this, because actually if you were to go up to anyone who believes in God and say, right, do you believe your God is all loving? Like, everyone's going to say, well, yeah, of course. Do you believe your God knows everything? They'll be like, yeah, of course. Do you believe that your God is all powerful? Of course. They've created and designed the universe, so of course I believe all those things. Okay, brilliant, let's go with that and let's see where we get to.
Well, it seems Darwin was so shrewd that his idea of evolution has even included God himself, because God had a very humble beginnings. He didn't start the Omni one. He was quite fallible to start with, and that latest edition, even the Jewish version of God, wasn't as perfect as it sort of evolved in Christianity. But we're seeing the evolution of the idea of God, obviously not God himself, because you and I don't believe, but the idea does exist in the heads of the believers, and it seems that he's undergone his own evolution.
Yeah, exactly. And we did talk about this in the last video, which is now you've got this abstraction of God out from the Yahwistic understanding of God as almost a corporeal being that walked among us, and that showed himself literally, to Moses and so on and so forth. You had this corporeal entity that over several thousands of years was philosophized about and abstracted from that position to this point where it's this abstract idea that sits outside the universe, created the universe, doesn't really get involved in any kind of like way these days as you might have seen originally in the Bible. But modern Christians believe in this abstract notion of God, but still this biblical corporeal version of God, and that presents itself as a problem, because actually marrying those two ideas is quite difficult. So they want their cake, and they want to keep it, and they want to eat it at the same time, and that's quite difficult. So yeah, books like, as I said before, Francesca Stavrakopoulou's book God and Anatomy, well worth reading to get to understand how God really was a corporeal being at the beginning, or certainly in the Jewish and Abrahamic faiths.
You also highlighted a contradiction or a problem with omniscience and omnibenevolence, especially in light of knowing that the vast majority of probably the 105 or 110 billion people so far who ever lived on Earth will eventually be sort of condemned to hell. So knowing that in advance, designing that from scratch, because we didn't ask to exist in the first place, and being omniscient sort of poses a problem.
Hugely so. And we'll come later, probably not in this episode, but later, to talk more explicitly about hell. But the idea that God would in advance know, and you can talk about Adam and Eve as if you believe in the literal Adam and Eve, and say, right, God, and we talked about this last time, but God knew in advance that Adam and Eve would do the wrong thing in the Garden of Eden, and that they would choose badly. Or even if you think they're symbolic, that they represent the fact that we will just choose badly, and then God punishes us on account of choosing badly, in daily life or in the Garden of Eden. And you're like, well, God knew that in advance, designed us in such a way that we were going to do that, and chose the world exactly, of all the possible worlds there could be, there is this world, at least, that exists, and has chosen this world such that we do that, because God has designed us in a way to do that, and God is ultimately responsible. And this presents a real problem, because, and in fact, that's one of the main arguments, one of the arguments we'll look at today, is God's, and we did, I sort of jumped the gun last time and did talk about it in the last video, but God is ultimately responsible for all the evil that we do, because God designed us in a way and knew that it's such that we would do it, and knew that we would do it, and created us anyway.
Right. You've also touched on a very logical point, and I think it's the one that if it's in front of a court, the accused would be completely acquitted at that point, which is the original sin, which pretty much Christianity is predicated upon. How can you err if your knowledge of responsibility at that point did not exist? So before eating from the forbidden fruit, Adam did not understand the difference between good and evil, did not understand what good or what evil was, yet he was judged based on this criteria for committing an act that was before the realization of these things.
It's a massive flaw in the story, and it is pretty obvious when you think about it. Although I never thought about it until, a few years back, and I was like, oh yeah, that's really weird. In fact, the whole story doesn't make sense. But that's kind of what you expect in mythological stories, right? When you look at all the different pantheons around the world, and you look at all the mythological stories, there are behaviors and things that happen that are just like, well, that's a bit weird. But they're just myths, right? And you forgive that of every other story, because it doesn't need to make sense, because they are myths that are just explaining how things. These are called etiological stories, so but stories that perhaps explain why things might come to pass. So for example, in Australia, you'll have creation myths that will explain why Uluru, as rock, exists, right? So you have these stories, these just so stories that explain stuff, these etiological stories. They exist in the Bible as well, incidentally. The pillar of salt explains literally a rock, and also the saltiness of the Dead Sea, and all sorts of stuff. So there are etiological stories all over the shop. But these stories, yeah, they are just not supposed to be 100%, sensible, with plots and themes that make total sense, because they're not true. They're not reality. They're just someone making stuff up, or communities making stuff up, or things evolving over a heap of time. Now, no one likes to say that as a Christian of their own Bible, or a Jew of their own Bible, or a Muslim of the Quran. But you would happily say about that about every other religious myth or story. And so it's just, this is called the outsider test for faith that John Loftus has written about, which is you should apply your critical faculties, hey, see what I did there, to your own religion in the same way that you apply it to every other religion.
Yeah, it's funny that ancient religions, or sort of stories about the creation, it's almost like they were a lot more mature, and sometimes these stories were understood to in the context of wisdom, of how you should behave going forward. Now knowing these kind of stories, and how you should sort of conduct yourself. While in the modern era, and those people who took the words literally have actually used these stories to impose certain ideas about that God, and these are absolute truth, and this is exactly how it was done, as if we're completely missing the point. Obviously, there are some new interpretations of the Bible and the Quran, and new waves of Muslims and Christians and Jews that would say, look, these stories were not even literal, but they're kind of stories to teach us the wisdom of God, because we didn't know much then, and you had to learn through stories just like a little child.
So this is a really important point, because there is a tension between literalism and symbolism. So there are clearly symbolic stories in the Bible, and there are clearly attempts at literal history. The problem is we are now living 2,000 years later plus, and we don't necessarily know, like, prima facie, which ones are supposed to be symbolic, which ones are literal. And then you get sort of believers who are literalist, like biblical literalists, which is like, well, all of it's historically true, even the obvious mythological trope stories, all of it's literally true. And it's like, well, there's a lack of clarity there, and you get another. So this is an issue to do with just the nature of history, really. The fact that we're 2,000 years later, we are not the intended, anyone in this society is not the intended audience for those books. And there will be loads of intertextual references and the way stories are created that would have appealed really strongly to the audiences at the time, the contemporaneous audiences, that we just miss now, that we don't get, because we are not those people living in those times and understanding the context in which those books are set. And that means that those biblical stories don't do their desired, don't fulfill their desired objectives on us, because we are not the correct audience. But the problem is, it's been canonized to become this like set of books that should be universally true forever. And I think that's a really problematic approach to take.
I think we've done a good job now summarizing sort of last conversation in 15 minutes. So we can now hopefully segue into and continue the story of God and find the holes. And while you're maybe going into that next argument, I'm going to, in the next 10 minutes or so, display an interesting comment that I got on the back of our last conversation. I would love your feedback on that.
Yeah, please do. So the first argument, we got only as far as, really, I think, chapter 3, argument 3, and we did an awful lot of talking, because so many of these individual arguments actually involve about 10 arguments. So you could say this is 300 arguments against the existence of God. So the first one is God loves abortion. Thank you so much, Chris. That's awesome. This is
thank you, Chris.
Yeah. Yeah, God loves abortion. That sounds weird and counterintuitive. So, I love this argument, and I've used it for a long time. And it's particularly it has particular purchase because so many Christians see themselves as pro-life, and they're so big in the abortion, pro-choice, anti-choice debate. And they say, oh, God, life starts at conception, and life has sanctity. There's a sanctity of life. And you go, okay, fair enough. I mean, I disagree with that. I disagree with the whole personhood debate, and we can get all philosophical about that, but I'm not going to. Yeah, I agree with you, Christian, whatever. Okay, if you think life starts at conception, you need to explain why God, who is all-loving, has designed and created reality for humanity such that somewhere between, and we're not sure, but somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of all fertilized eggs die before they come to term. Right? Whether this happens right at the beginning with a lack of implantation, whether it happens in the first trimester with a lot of sort of, other complications that can take place, whether it happens miscarriages throughout pregnancy up to stillbirths, right? All of that whole range of stuff that can go wrong accounts for somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of all human life that is created by conception. So if you're saying that, in America, X million babies are murdered, humans are murdered each year, which, is problematic language anyway. But if you're going to say that, then you need to account for why God, your supreme moral entity, has designed and created a reality in which literally billions of human lives, as you define them, are dying each year. And over the history of time, that is many, many, many billions. I mean, we are talking serious numbers here that fail to implant or are rejected in utero, or what. It doesn't really matter how it happens.
So, Jonathan, how would you then address the counter argument that would say, well, this particular sanctity of life is meant to be observed within the human species. But for the creator and the designer, he can take and dispense of life as he willeth.
Yeah, this is the most because they've got nowhere else to go on this. I mean, I think this is really worth noting, is that they're forced to say this, because I don't think they want to. I don't think a Christian would really want to say, God has the right to take life as he wills, which is what this argument is. God has the right to just snuff out life, because actually it makes God look morally problematic. So then they are forced to do another move, which is to say God is not a moral agent. God has no moral obligations. This is what William Lane Craig does. But you can understand why they do this, because actually they're forced to do it. Because really, you wouldn't want to do that. You want to say God is an amazing moral agent. You know, if you were starting with like, how can I imagine? What would I imagine of God? God is the perfect moral agent that does things that are just really obviously, clearly, morally brilliant, and everything's fine. And I understand why everything works like it does. And there's moral intelligibility of the universe, right? The problem is there isn't moral intelligibility of the universe. God does loads of weird things if God exists, like creating humanity such that most human beings die before we even realize they exist. And then we have to say, well, God's therefore not a moral agent and has no obligations. And then you have to jump through all these hoops. And I would disagree with, all of those movements. I think it seems obscene that God has the right to take life. As if I go back to the analogy I said last time, which is imagine you, Hanney, a lab scientist who is a genius, and you are able to create sentient life in your own lab. Right, and you create these sentient creatures out of nothing that all feel and have lives and feelings and all this stuff, and you create them. Like if you were just a sentient lab scientist that did that, and then you created these beings, and then you shot them all in the face, right? Like if we saw that, we'd say, you can't do that. Those are sentient beings. Although you're responsible for creating them, they are still like now sentient beings with feelings and stuff. You can't just shoot them in the face and kill them. And you can't just go, well, I created them, I can kill them.
It's actually gone one step sinister, because if a mad scientist has done that, maybe trying to create a perfect animal, and that animal start disobeying the creator and say, okay, I brought you out of nothingness and I'm going to turn you back into nothingness, and it's the end of the story. But imagine that mad scientist would make that being eternal and torture that sentient being for reaching all these shortcomings after creating him out of nothing. He's gone further than just terminating that life.
And it's worse, because actually God knew that would happen in advance. It's like, God, I'm going to create this universe whereby I know that billions of human beings will be conceived, and I'm going to snuff them out before they get to like even be born. And I'm going to know about that in advance. It doesn't appear to fulfill any objective. Like there's no greater good that comes of this. So most of the problem of evil is like, why does all this suffering exist in light of omnigod, right? So theists will present things called theodicies, which are reasons why this horrible scenario exists, right? In this case, why would God create a world in which like fetuses would die like that? And so and especially if the mother doesn't even know about it. So you can't build the soul of the mother by getting over this terrible like problem and then becoming a better person as well. Like imagine, like in most cases, the mother doesn't even know. So we get having all these snuffed out life forms that humans don't even know about. We only find about it through science and whatnot. So you can't even build a theodicy that makes any sense out of this, because it can't be connected to any human behavior. It's just like, it just looks horrible. And so therefore, as we say, the theist then has to say, well, God has the right to do it. It just has the right to do it. Don't ask me.
I completely agree with you. Another scene, the one just before the Exodus, and obviously Pharaoh doesn't let the Jews go, and suddenly God takes a license to end the life of all the firstborn, the kids, just to twist the arm of Pharaoh so they can let his people go. So what has these innocent children do? And why choose such a horrible way why just change Pharaoh's heart?
Yeah. I mean, that's a whole other kettle of. I mean, goodness, how you can kill all firstborn Egyptian? Literally, it says it very clearly. All the children of the nation, because after hardening Pharaoh's heart, so that you're killing them because Pharaoh said no, but you hardened his heart such that he said no. So you're killing children because of something you did. A God, like it's just morally obscene. So therefore, the Christian has to come back. I know Ray Osham has said this in the live chat, which is, it gets back to the whole skeptical theism. You can't know the mind of God. Don't question God. He's infinitely more knowledgeable than you. So there is a good reason. You just can't know that reason. It's like that is absolutely not good enough. So this comes back to an abductive argument that we talked about before, which is, if you know about, all these billions of fetal deaths and blastocyst deaths, if you like, if you know if that's your data point, does it better support Omni God, who is all loving and has supreme responsibility and power in designing, creating the optimal universe? Or does it better support naturalistic atheism, which has no need for that to be have a moral dimension at all? So it's just shit happens and fetuses die and it's horrible, and let's do stuff that can stop that or better that or whatever, right? But we're not beholden to making our world fit to some kind of moral paradigm. Now, what does it better support? Naturalistic atheism, obviously. So abductive arguments here, I mean, this is where you go, yes, you can bolt on some kind of don't question the mind of God, but that's all you've got, and that's not good enough. And it really, like, if I was thinking about what hypothesis does this universe better is better explained by, I would say naturalistic atheism all the
time. Before we move on from this argument, because I think to me this is quite obvious. 1-0, like that's an early goal. And VAR won't even be able to stop that. Elijah, and the situation, the bold guy, and the bunch of children taking the mickey, and suddenly the bear or she bear turn up to tear them apart. What do you think of this? I mean, this is laughable. What do you think of it?
But again, it's like, so the job of the Christian, you've got to feel sorry sometimes for theists, because their job is to maintain their holy book and their God on this pedestal up here. So the job of theology is to create a framework such that God is maintained up here at all costs, all rational costs, and at all times, right? So here you have this story, which is obviously just is fulfilling other functions, right? And it's not interested in making God look all loving and blah blah blah. This is telling you other things, right? And you have this story, and then 2,000 years later, where we have this belief that God is all loving, all knowing, and all powerful. And it's that abstraction that has to marry up still with this holy book down here. You're like, and a holy book has 42 children being ripped to death by a she-bear for calling someone bald. And you're like, oh, goodness, right. How do we explain this? And of course, for us, it's just a laughable story that's just, well, it's not laughable. It's a pretty horrible story, but it's just like, we don't need to do anything other than say, yeah, it's a mythological, untrue story.
So some of the funniest apologies I've heard about this story is it doesn't actually tell you clearly that the she bear turning up to kill the children has actually to do as a punishment, like she wasn't sent by God. It just coincidentally happened after it.
Thrown it in the story, just like these. I'm going to tell you a story that's going to end up in the canonized book of like Revelations forevermore. It's going to be these kids. They took the mickey out this guy, and then randomly a bear came up and ate all of them. I don't know what that tells you. Just either it tells you that God could have stopped that but didn't, and just let 42 kids die. Either way you paint it is.
Do you suspect that this particular verse or chapter was written by somebody who's bold?
Yeah. This is like, there's some projection going on here. It's like, if I'm going to do anything, I'm going to write into this holy book.
Don't you dare!
That is protecting bald people. Like, it's like I wrote it. Don't do it. Ginger bald people, who are once ginger and now bald, they are protected forever. Like, you'll get eaten by she-bears. Don't do it. Yeah,
that's brilliant.
So I think that it's just it's a thankless task going back through the Bible and trying to jive the whole book with our modern sensibilities. Slavery. As I said to you last time, it loses on slavery. You can dump the book there. I mean, I'm that harsh about the Bible these days that I'm like, it obviously fails about slavery. And not only that, it's used for 1,900, last 2,000 years to justify slavery. And God knew that would happen and still sanctioned that as his holy book. And if he does that, he's morally abhorrent. I'm sorry, there's not good enough. That book's not good for me. It's not good for everyone. Ditch it. And yet people still believe. Oh, I can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry. I mean, this argument to me is blatantly obvious. It doesn't need dwelling on. It's very obvious. There are so many areas where God has sort of chosen certain, for children or for humans to be dispensed off as if they're nothing. And I mean, there are too many to count. So it's done.
So then we're still keeping on these design arguments, but I did cover this in the last video, which is God is morally culpable for our sins. So I don't know if we might want to skip over this, but very quickly, God designed humans such that we failed, either in general or in Adam and Eve. And God knew about that in advance, but designed us anyway, as I said earlier. And so therefore, God is morally responsible for our fallen nature. And the problem with any problem of evil argument, or any problem of evil argument against God for theists, is that they are presented with a whole bunch of data that shows God to either be a poor designer or morally abhorrent, right? And if that's the case, remember the job of the theist and the apologist and the theologian is to keep God as morally perfect at the top. So you present all these reasons why God is morally imperfect, and they have to create arguments to defend that, and it's just such a thankless task, because if God has full divine foreknowledge and has created us to fall, then God is morally responsible. But for the theist, God cannot be morally responsible for our shortcomings, and so therefore they have to invent mechanisms that put that responsibility back onto the humans, because God cannot be at fault. So therefore, for our fallen nature, it is our fault. It's like we designed our own nature. So basically, it's because the only way that theists can generally do this is to present libertarian free will as the mechanism that gets us to fall. So we chose to do things badly, but then God knew in advance that we were going to do that and create us anyway, and created us in such a way that we would choose in that way. So it's all really problematic. I mean, divine foreknowledge is your big problem here.
Right. This is the question, the comment I told you about, Jonathan, from Janice Beams. There are no sound arguments against God. There are errant pseudoscience claims. There is a deception and there is a repeated misinformation. But critical thinking is never employed to argue against the existence of God, because all of the evidence support a supernatural realm and a creator. The spiritual realm is a foundation of all physical existence and is wholly dependent on the spiritual law or word of God. We derive our existence from God himself.
I mean, with all due respect, which I don't want to be harsh here, but the respect due is very little there, because that is just a mere assertion. All that is saying you're wrong because you're wrong, and you're not using critical rationality. Well, okay, citation required. So it's like there's no reference to any particular argument. You get this loads. I mean, all over my videos, that I have with people, yourself, Derek Lambert, you get people saying stuff like that, which is like, oh, these arguments are rubbish or whatever. And it's like never an example where they say this particular argument was rubbish because of this. It's just like, it's like burying your head in the sand and saying, yeah, they're all wrong. There's obvious evidence that God exists. Okay, well, what is that evidence? This just like is completely unsubstantiated. And so it's an unsubstantiated criticism of my position, but it's an unsubstantiated criticism, exposition of their own position. And if you are going to present a case with no substance, then I can dismiss it without presenting any substance.
You got to upload the effort though, because look at this large claim. Because all of the evidence supports a supernatural realm and a creator. I mean, where does that come from?
Just all of the evidence, and it's just you're just going around in your own circular world. I would assume. Again, it goes back to abductive arguments. Again, we've got two hypotheses, or what I'm trying to do here with all these arguments, say we've got these two competing hypotheses. Here's the data. What does it better? What predicts the data better, and what is better explained? Which hypothesis better explains the data? And each time, to me at least, is very clearly naturalistic atheism, unless you can show me otherwise. And a commenter like that is not showing us otherwise. The commenter is just saying, you're wrong. I'm not going to tell you why. You're just wrong. See you later.
Right. I mean, in a dissertation, in a PhD or a master degree, you would know that this person will actually lose so many points that they would actually be failing, because they're not zoning on the problem. They're providing generic comments, and like any academic will actually mark this person as an F, because you haven't really provided any evidence or citation.
I guess that's what happens, though, when you feel threatened. I don't want to armchair psychoanalyze here, but, someone that feels threatened by a bunch of arguments against their position, that you're thinking, oh, my goodness, I don't necessarily have the answers to these. Then you're just like, yeah, you're wrong, blah, blah, blah. You say all that stuff because it makes you feel better. And you think by giving an answer, you're providing the answer, and that's a really common thing. I had a debate against Lydia McGrew on Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio, and this is about the nativity, and it's really interesting. So I've written a book on the nativity called The Nativity: A Critical Examination. So and I presented many of the arguments in that, and she presented answers for a lot of my arguments, and because she sounds really like clever and very erudite, she would present an answer which was a very, very, very exceedingly low probability answer, something that is conceptually possible. And this is the possibiliter ergo probabiliter fallacy, which is it's possible, therefore it's probable. So it's like, here's something that could have happened, therefore it's what probably happened, therefore it's what did happen. And they make these big jumps from conceptually possible to, yeah, that answers that. And so you get all these people in the comments below saying, oh, yeah, she won that debate. I'm like, no, she didn't. She presented a bunch of things that were conceptually possible and said, there's your answer. That's not. So you need to be more critical on your evaluation of a debate like that, because you are just thinking your person said something that sounded intelligent, therefore they answered that and they won that particular point. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. Or it's not how it should work. It is how it does work, but it's not how it should work.
Jonathan, in your demonstration of the 30 arguments, you make sure that you always sort of anchor them. They're specific. And then you reference them to the holy text, and you go to the world out there and you compare. So you're constantly doing that comparison between what's better explaining the information we've got, or the status quo we've got as a reality, the holy text, or science and reality.
And a lot of these arguments, I don't actually go to the holy text or data. So some of these arguments are purely metaphysical and to do with just the characteristics and how does this work? If this is how we understand this, then this is a real problem with looking at this. And so actually, this isn't necessarily a case of having to look at the evidence of Earth or the holy book. It's like, what is the understanding of a God entity? And for example, God is infinitely just and infinitely merciful, or optimally perfectly just and perfectly merciful. Well, how does that make sense? I don't need to look at data and this and that. I just need to understand what mercy means and understand what justice means. And you can't have these two together. Like they are basically non-compatible. So if you're saying God is perfect at both of these things, then we've got a problem. So this is just a language and definitional game.
Yeah. So it's true. If it's the argument predicated on logic and abstract, you don't need to because you can't actually prove the existence of these things to start with.
So this idea. So as I said, we covered the idea that I think God is morally culpable for the actions of humans, because God designed us and created our nature. And if we got a fallen nature, then that's God creating us. We didn't design our nature. Like, we are contingent beings, according to theists. We are contingent beings entirely of a necessary God, right? And we didn't get a say in any of that process. So how God can then say that it's our fault that we acted like this when he knowingly designed and created us such that we would do this is a bizarre move, is a bad move. But it gets worse because this is compounded with atonement, which you got to remember that atonement is the basis of why Jesus exists. This is the basis of Christianity. You've got the Holy Trinity, which doesn't make sense, and you've got atonement, which doesn't make sense, right? And these are the two core tenets of Christianity. They don't make sense. And it should always be a warning when there are like 10 different theories of atonement and no theologian can agree on which one is correct. So it's like, okay, so this is the main reason Jesus existed, and actually you will disagree on this. Like this is like, so you're a Christian, you believe that Christ died and atoned for our sins, but none of you agree on how this works and what the theory of atonement is. Okay, this is a major problem. But anyway,
why in the first place? Because as you said before, why would you carry the burden of somebody else's choice? You could have done something different faced by the same incident of do not eat from that fruit tree.
Yeah, I mean, so you've got the whole idea of God creating us such that we do this, and then demanding a payment as well. You know, so it's terrible in and of itself. I mean, God looks like a poor designer or creator, or just morally suboptimal. But then he says, hey, you know that morally suboptimal design and creation I've done? I'm demanding payment from a third party to me for my suboptimal design and creation. It's like, hang on, how does that work? That's like walking up to someone in the street, punching them in the face, and then demanding $10,000 for the fact that you've punched them in the face. It's like, I don't understand how that works. So atonement for me,
you hit my fist with your face.
yeah, exactly. You are at fault for this. But of course, this is a move that Christians have to do, is because God cannot be at fault for anything. So everything that is bad about the universe, and this goes into the natural world as well. And this is why the problem of evil, for natural evil, is far more powerful, is because they still have to connect that to humanity, because it has to be humanity's fault that things are poor out here, like in the design and creation of natural stuff. Because if it's not our fault, then it's God's fault. And there are only two options here. Like, if it's God's fault, God is not omni-God. But if it's our fault, then that gets God off the hook. But hang on, we were designed and created by God, and he's ultimately responsible for us. So God is still ultimately responsible for this, even if it is our fault. And this is an unsolvable problem for Christians, for theists, in my opinion. There's just no way around this. God is responsible. There are some holy books, and in the Bible, I think there's a few elements where it says God is responsible for suffering. But kind of like they're kind of like forgotten, and then you concentrate on these other bits. Like, actually, no, you really should take note.
I think Jonathan Bart Ehrman has sort of relayed that, because that's I think what led Bart Ehrman to lose his faith. Is where suffering come from, because he said in the Bible there are three different areas. It says suffering comes because as a punishment for the evildoers, or because of the nature of the evildoers, and sometimes it's because God wanted to be so. So it's actually the Bible itself is confused about the source of evil.
Absolutely, and you know, I still haven't seen a good enough answer for these. I mean, all that really Christians go back to is skeptical theism, which is there might be a reason, because that's all they can do, right? And so that's why skeptical theism is so powerful, and they compartmentalize it. So theists will go through their daily lives thinking, I really like praying, I really like the community in my church, I really like doing all my churchy stuff. Suffering and evil, there might be there's conceptually could be a reason for it. So therefore there is a reason, possibility, ergo probability. There is a reason for it. Put that into the corner of my brain over here, and then carry on doing all my Christian stuff. And it's like, oh yeah, I understand how that works from a psychological point of view, but philosophically, I don't think it carries enough weight, that kind of.
Well, the morality argument is one of those interesting ones, because it's got abstract logical elements, but it's also got some scientific elements, because as we get to understand our brains a lot more, and neuroscience are telling us a lot more about our nature, how we react, when we choose to do something, do we really choose to do something, or our brains have actually decided to do something few seconds, up to 5 seconds before we think we've chosen it? Everything in neuroscience is telling us that the free will thingy is nothing but an illusion.
Yeah, so my first book was on free will. I deny that libertarian free will exists, and I think both metaphysics and science tells us that. In fact, science is predicated upon the causal determination in the universe. Like, science is about explaining data. So you say this happened for a reason. Oh, are you there? Okay.
Yeah.
So sorry, you just went there. So science is about, principle of sufficient reason. So, that this happened for a reason. So let's investigate what this reason is. At no point does science go, oh, free will, or, oh, God did it, or whatever. So, and this stretches to psychology and behavior. So if you go into a psychiatrist's chair, like room, and, pay for your therapy session, and you lie down on the chaise longue, and the psychiatrist says, okay, so you've got this problematic behavior you told me about. Why did you do it? And if you said back to him, oh, because I chose to, I just freely chose to, they don't go, oh, thank you very much. That solves that then. That's $150. I'll see you next week. Because they say, oh, no, I really need to understand that behavior. So talk to me about your background. Talk to me about your parental scenario. Talk to me about, your history up until this point. And then we'll understand genetics. We'll understand some biology. We'll understand your environment. So it's unpicking your behavior in terms of all these causal determinants. So psychology completely predicated upon a lack of libertarian free will, which is like, you are doing stuff for reasons. No one just goes, I'm doing that because of free will, and that free will is a magic entity that's not related to anything to do with me and who I am and my biology and genetics and previous learning and experience in life. So the only ideas of free will that make any sense, I mean, Daniel Dennett would admit this as a compatibilist, which is to say that free will and determinism are compatible, which is to say that free will is only really best understood when you link it to causal determinism, which is you freely chose to do that because you wanted to do that. The idea then is like, well, okay, let's unpick why you wanted to do that. Why were you the sort of person that wants to do this? So if you believe free will is just doing what you want, we need to unpick why you want certain things. So it depends how you define free will. But yeah, like.
But Jonathan, even if I'm a compatibilist, but even compatibilists are determinists.
Yes,
core.
so
I'm like Cypher from the Matrix, who chose to eat the fake steak, knowing it's not there, but that's how you keep your sanity. You're saying, well, we just have to live as if it exists.
So there's several things going on there. So that's soft determinism. Compatibilism is sometimes called soft determinism for exactly that reason. So classical compatibilists will say, right, we have free will, but determinism is also true. So they basically say free will is doing what you want, rather than a libertarian free will says you can do what you want, but if you rewound to that moment, you could actually do something else. The soft determinists say you couldn't do anything else, but what you did was at least what you wanted to do. And then the hard determinist says, well, we need to unpick that a little bit more and say, because so Arthur Schopenhauer said, man can do what he wills, but he can't will what he wills, which is to say that, okay, we can choose to do what we want, but we can't choose what we want, if you see what I mean. So the hard determinists will then take it just a step back and say, okay, let's unpick what's going on here. And if there are causal determinants of what you want and your desires and your volition, then this means that free will doesn't exist. But it's a semantic difference because they both believe in this track that goes down for human beings. Now, out of those positions, you can then get. So I think these days I would call myself both a hard determinist and a compatibilist. Like, it just depends how you define it. Mm-hmm. But I would say I'm probably a free will illusionist, which is to say that we think we've got free will, and most of the day I go through the day thinking I've got free will because I shout at my kids for doing something that really annoy me, right? So I'm like, but of course I could just as well say, well, they're just doing what they're doing because they are who they are in the causal circumstance they found themselves in.
But that's not how things work. Yeah,
that's not.
And Daniel Dennett sort of said it very nicely, and he's connected to consciousness, whether it's an illusion or not. And I think I do agree with him a lot on this when he said consciousness and issues of free will, all these things are supposed to be an illusion, but they are useful illusions. we are the beneficiaries of that illusion. We're not the victims of it.
Yeah, and he would talk about the argument with him, and there's two philosophers, Greg Caruso and Daniel Dennett, will argue about whether Daniel Dennett, I think, still thinks that we are morally blameworthy, whereas Greg Caruso says no. I think the way that we understand the world means that we aren't morally blameworthy, but it then gets a bit complicated. But it's interesting thing. People like P.F. Strawson, a philosopher, who said, again, is a compatibilist, didn't believe in free will as in libertarian free will, so causal determinism, but he said, we have these reactive attitudes, which are psychological attitudes where you react to certain blameworthy and praiseworthy behaviors in others. So you say, so someone punches someone else in the face. You don't sit there and go, well, he was always going to do what he was going to do in the situation he was in. You go, oi, don't do that. And you react, and you can't help psychologically reacting because that's in our DNA. He says that. So he said these reactive attitudes are so strong that we can't really overcome them. So we might as well believe that free will exists. And then he builds a kind of free will case on top of these kind of what he calls reactive attitudes.
The other argument, and still falls within science, how precise these curses are. Like we know with epigenetic, for example, some people might have the disposition of maybe being a little bit violent. But based on social upbringing and exposure to multiple situations, you could end up with a killer, a criminal, or the gold medal winner, representing his country in.
Yes, stay with me. Sorry about that. What you're talking about is exactly this. So this, I think I may have said this in the last video. This is one of the best books I've ever read. It's called The Anatomy of Violence by Adrian Raine, The Biological Roots of Crime. But actually, it's not just the biological roots, because he talks about something called the biosocial jigsaw, which is kind of what you're hinting at there, which is your environment, your biology, your genetics, and how each of those components work together as a jigsaw to create antisocial behavior. So what is it that makes antisocial behavior? And it's absolutely, I've just got goosebumps thinking about the book. It's so brilliant. Yeah. And there's so much evidence in there, which of course then leads you to go, well, obviously free will isn't a thing, because we can really understand why people do what they do. The real debate around free will is not as to whether it exists or not. I think that's pretty much been solved in philosophy. The question is, what do you do with that knowledge now? So how do you deal with fatalism, the idea that, oh, well, there's no point doing anything because it's all like determined? What do you do with moral responsibility? What do you do with crime and punishment? What do you do with blameworthiness and praiseworthiness? So those are the interesting questions. But I think that it exists in libertarian form or not is a kind of been and gone as a debate. But if you look at the Phil Papers survey Phil Papers survey results, which is a study done of all philosophers, not all, but a huge amount of philosophers around the world. They did one in 2009. They've just done another one. I need to look at the data for that. But certainly the 2009 study found that the only philosophers who believed in libertarian free will happen to be, and the metadata shows, happen to be the philosophers who also believe in God. So this is really, really, really important. So why is that? Well, because they need libertarian free will. It goes back to what I said earlier, to hang everything on humans for being morally responsible for their actions and not God as the ultimate designer. It has to be us because we just freely chose to be bad. And
also, what makes our God so bad? I mean, if there is a God who designed humans to be just like robots and there's no free will, that God is sort of reputation is gone forever.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm going to part that. I'm just going to come on to that argument. Actually, that's one of my next arguments: is God has no free will. But So the idea of free will gets you humans being responsible, and it gets you heaven and hell, right? So if you didn't believe in libertarian free will, heaven and hell make no sense, because you're punishing people and rewarding people for just fulfilling what they were always going to do, because they are who they are in the situation they are in. And so heaven and hell don't make any sense. So if you're if you're a Christian or a theistic philosopher, you are going to believe in libertarian free will because you have to, if your primary beliefs are in God, a judgmental God, who advocates for heaven and hell. So if that's your core belief, judgmental God, heaven and hell, free will, you have to have that. These beliefs supervene on libertarian free will. That means they depend upon libertarian free will. So that is a core fundamental position.
So Jonathan, how do Calvinists fit in this? Because I think Calvinists have a bit of a twisted sort of idea about determinism and whether we had free will in the first place. But for some reason or somehow, they can fit the two together. They can believe in a God who's a benevolent God and yet in determinism.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, on the one hand, I laud Calvinists for actually having a better understanding of reality. So yeah, that yes, you understand, and they will generally agree with all the scientific and philosophical arguments that we can present for the lack of libertarian free will existing. But on the other hand, they still believe in a loving God. Right, so they have what's called the elect and the reprobates, which is there's a certain number of people who are going to go to heaven, a certain number of people who are going to go to hell, and there's naffle you can do about it. There's nothing you can do about it. God has decided before creating, and that's that. Which is like, well, what's the point of creating a huge amount of people that are just going to go to hell, and you know they're going to go to hell, and they've got no free will to get out of going to hell. They're just going to go to hell. And God has designed and created them in such a way that they're going to do that. That is morally reprehensible.
I agree. It's a very strange position to have. Again, this is going to be always an area, and I agree that if you believe in free will, you're going to be somehow a theist. To be able to. This is the worldview that you have to adopt.
You get very few naturalistic libertarian free will philosophers. Very few. Robert Cain was one. There's a couple, but yeah. So on the arguments front, I'm going to come to the free will. There's a couple of free will ones that are pertinent to the book that I use in the book. But just the last design one is quite a big one and an important one, which is why don't we photosynthesize? So again, to talk about God's design, and if God is ultimately responsible for designing and creating reality, this universe, one of the big problems, as I said before, the natural evil problems are much worse because you can't really connect them to humans. Theists try. The one move that they have is the original sin. So they say, because if you don't have original sin, right, you look at the natural world, you think, goodness me, it's horrible, it's evil, earthquakes, stuff's happening, is terrible, animals are ripping each other apart every day, causing untold amounts of death, right, and suffering. So it's horrible. Nature is red in tooth and claw. Therefore, it has to be humans' fault. So they go original sin. So Adam and Eve fell, the fall. Therefore, it was all perfect before the fall. It's prelapsarian, isn't it? So everything was perfect before the fall, and then it all went wrong. And it's all Adam and Eve's fault. So in a literalistic sense, it's Adam and Eve's fault, or in a symbolic sense, it's humans' fault. But then, if you take the symbolic action, it was like, well, actually, there was horrible things going on before humans had even evolved in human evolution. So that doesn't work. So it has to be this literal understanding, which is Adam and Eve just picked a fruit from the tree. And as a result, animals can now rip each other to bits. And as a result, I don't know, tsunamis can kill 230,000 people like that. It's like, but that's the only move the theist has. They have to say it's humans' fault, because otherwise it's God's fault.
But then, Jonathan, you have to believe almost like in a Flintstone type of world where humans were riding dinosaurs. But we know from, again, science has to invoke itself. Homo sapiens are only about 300,000 years old.
Yeah. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense. So the argument that I present is, well, okay, if you're design, again, it's like, what does the data better support? And if I predicted an all-loving God, so if I started with an all-loving God and I predicted what kind of world an all-loving God would create, who had omnipotence and omniscience, so would know how to design the most optimal world, I would say, well, carnivorousness is really problematic. You've got billions of years or millions of years, hundreds of millions of years of animals causing pain and suffering to other animals to merely exist, right? In order that I exist as some kind of mammal, I have to rip apart this other animal and eat it, because I don't get to choose. I'm not sentient. I don't have like free will like humans have, and the ability to talk and do all this stuff and cogitate. I'm just like, I am sentient, but I've been evolved to eat this thing. So I'm going to rip it apart and eat it. And that happens all over the world and has done for millions and millions of years, right? Is that what we'd expect on Omnigod or on naturalistic evolution? Oh my goodness, naturalistic evolution every day of the week. Yeah. So there's no contest. So I made myself watch a video on YouTube once of a baby water buffalo being ripped apart by a pride of lions while it was live. And it took like 5 minutes plus 10 minutes for it to die, as it was just being like literally eaten alive. And it was horrific. I was like, I have to watch this because I really have to understand what has been going on for hundreds of millions of years. And then you say, well, how could it have been? Well, we know photovoltaic cells. You've got an electric car coming. So, we can generate energy through the sun. Plants do it all the time. Why could God not have designed humanity and all animals in such a way that we derived all our energy needs from the sun? We can all photosynthesize, and God could do that by changing a couple of physical constants, or just changing the laws of or how evolution works, or perpetual miracles. Just like do miracles all the time. We wouldn't necessarily know or whatever, but we wouldn't. It isn't necessary, surely, that animals are ripping each other to bits just to survive. It's horrific.
Completely agree. I mean, this is probably beside the story. Has this sort of narrative has led you to contemplate being a vegetarian, or?
So I am actually a vegan. But I was a bit of a sidebar here. I had written pieces when I still ate meat against eating meat, but saying I'm too morally weak to not eat meat. I like it too much, right? And you find a lot of people. I've read some people who I won't name names. So there's a couple of philosophers who I really rate, right, who have written pieces defending the meat industry. And you're thinking, oh, these are just post hoc rationalizations. These are just you justifying your own meat eating. Whereas myself, I'm not going to justify eating meat. It is morally worse than not eating meat. It's just that I am morally imperfect. I was going for the honest approach, which is like, yeah, I'd like to be a vegan. I'm just not quite good enough. And then I developed multiple sclerosis. And one of the options that's advised for trying to deal with MS is to change your diet and to become vegan for a whole bunch of reasons. I won't bore you with them. You either take on a paleo diet or a vegan diet. I opted with the vegan diet. And that gave me the kick up my ass to become a vegan. I actually eat fish as well, just because of the omega-3 and the nutrients from fish, which are really important for MS. But I'm trying to use fish substitutes now, actually. So anyway, I can now lord it over people morally, right? I can just say, yeah, I'm morally better than you. Obviously not. But I understand that these arguments, should lead me towards veganism if I want to be as morally good as I can be. They didn't because I was weak. They do now because I was kind of forced to with my MS. But now, actually, I was speaking to my partner the other day. We went out for a meal and I didn't have many vegan options. And she said, oh, do you want to just have this meat thing? And really, in principle, I wouldn't have had a problem with that. So I was like, no, I am actually now in a position where actually I'm a moral vegan as well as doing it for health reasons. So I'm not going to do that. So, but I'm not one of these people that lords it over anyone else. But I do find it interesting. You can go to a cocktail party and imagine someone saying, hey, I'm a paedophile vegan, right? And they go, what? You're a vegan? So
that's a choice anyway. I mean, I've turned vegetarian about 4 years ago now, so I'm well on my way for the same reasons. I think it's very good and it's very comforting to live your own principles. It's when you feel that and you go like, okay, I'm at peace, because exactly like for the last 20 years I've been trying to become a vegetarian or a vegan, and I was so weak. And I think it's called, I was philosophical vegetarian. Like I knew it was the right thing to do. I knew I hated to see that, and therefore the pain and the suffering of these animals are way more important than my taste buds. I knew that.
Interestingly, my moral position weights it slightly more as an environmental choice. So the amount of water and energy required to sustain the meat industry compared to vegetables is just far outweighs it. Like, it's the animal suffering as well, of course, but actually, for me, the environmental argument is a really big winner, and I think eventually it will become an economic argument. Veganism or vegetarianism will become so much more prevalent, mainly due to economic reasons.
Oh, that's the big picture, because if you, I mean, you can save one animal from being eaten, and that's just the sort of the emotional bit of it. But if the whole universe or the planet is collapsing because of certain exercise, then you're saving a whole lot of species at the same time.
Yeah, so it's land use, it's energy use, it's water use, all those things. And if you're producing feed, if you're producing a bunch of crops to feed animals, to eat the animals, just eat the crops, because actually that's a really inefficient process where you're deriving your energy from these animals at the end of the chain, and you're losing energy all the way along there. So it's just really, really inefficient. So anyway, that's why that is important. I'm glad you brought that out, because
I know it's a very interesting proposition there.
That's one of my arguments in the book. So in the book, I talk about how, in fact, it's part of this argument. I say, okay, so why don't we photosynthesize? And then I say, well, why do we even need energy? Why has God created this entire existence where we need energy to merely survive? And then you go, well, you know, because he could have it any other way. It could be perpetual miracles, but we have this situation where we require energy to survive, and that means we are fighting over resources in finite resource areas. This is what nature does, and it's what humans do, etc., etc. So then you say, well, why do we even need bodies if the end game is an eternity in heaven? Which an eternity in heaven, infinite time compared to finite life on earth, which is nothing, it's an infinitesimal fraction compared to the eternity. Then the end game is eternity. If that's where we're going, if that's where you want us to go, don't even bother creating this whole scenario where we need energy and we have to rip each other apart to exist. And we have all this pain and suffering. We've got earthquakes and tsunamis. Just create us in heaven. And this is one of the big arguments later in the book, is just create heaven. Just put us in heaven. Don't create the ones that weren't going to go to heaven, and create the ones that were going to go to heaven in heaven. Job done. No suffering.
Yeah. Some would argue, though, heaven, it could be a hell. Like heaven, the way it's portrayed in the holy text, and especially in the Quran. I think Christopher Hitchens said it once. He said, we always sort of imagine the paradise where there's harp music playing in the background, you're laying on the grass, and he's like, you fantasize about this for like eternity, but you wouldn't do it for 5 minutes in real life.
So there are a couple of things, like there's philosophical boredom that will exist. So you've got to get over the problem that living for eternity is like, Jesus, you would have experienced everything. And it's just like, so you'd have to be constantly reset in some way. So you got those kind of problems. That's another thing. But as you say, Jim Jeffries, the Australian comedian, did a really good segment on hell. You should go and look at it. There's a 9-minute video on YouTube, really worth looking. And he's talking about how basically all his mates are down in hell, you know, doing drugs, prostitutes, and all this. He's like, that's where I want to be. Oh, being a comedian, I don't justify doing those things, but he's like, and I'm up here with like my priest Uncle Eddie, who used to make me sit on his knee and all this kind of stuff. So so he's like, I don't want to be up here with Aunt Edna and Uncle Eddie, or you know, all this kind of stuff. Is like exactly that. Is a really great routine. So yeah, check out his hell routine. So yeah, so that is, I think, really, really interesting to talk about, you know, why we need energy, and, you know, why, because again, I go back to this idea, and I said this in the last video, that is all data needs explaining in omni-God. It doesn't with our naturalistic evolution. It's just shit happens in brute universe and whatever. That's it. It's just how it is. Whereas when you say, well, why do we need energy to survive? Why isn't there perpetual motion machines? Why is there law of conservation of energy? All these things. Like, given omni-God, you have to explain why that is the best way to exist. Like, whatever why the sky's blue, why, you know, any kind of data needs explaining in omni-God. Sorry, you've got some things to say.
No, not at all. I'm just sort of displaying the people's comments. I mean, Lena is the moderator of the channel, and she's half Syrian, half Spanish. And she's giving you a tip to have a look at the Arabic aperitifs and appetizers are quite good, and for vegans and vegetarians, there is a lot of variety.
Good tip. Thank you. Thank you. And again, that's going to be as a result of, I mean, aside by here, that's going to be a result of, those climates and geographies aren't conducive to huge amounts of farming of animals, because you just can't get it out of the ground. So therefore, it's kind of like necessarily you will have had to have developed a cuisine that comes from not eating massive amounts of animals.
I mean, there's a big argument as well that our prefrontal lobe cortex, which is pretty much where the moral area and the amygdala is located, and that sort of leap forward has happened on the back of two things that happened during our evolution: eating meat and cooking at some point.
Yeah.
So you could argue you might not have the necessary IQ to realize the moral or the environment unless your ancestors have eaten meat at some point.
Absolutely, and I don't deny that for one bit. But this is, of course, what's known as a naturalistic argument and a genetic argument, which is like we understand how it came to be and we understand how it's naturally come to be, but it doesn't mean that's how it should be, and that is really important. So yeah, 100%, we absolutely needed to eat meat, cook meats, in order to get to where we are now. But we are where we are now, and do we still need to do that? Not necessarily. Okay, let's not do that. So yeah, I'm with you.
Do you think Hume's law is never going to be broken then, that you can never get aught from his? I think here is a situation where there is a situation, but you ought to do something different rather than what's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, the ought from the is a classic old debate. That just because that's how it is isn't how it should be. I think it is very difficult to get an ought from an is. To try to not objectify, it's probably the wrong word, to try and make an objective morality, like Sam Harris did this in The Moral Landscape, tried to make like a self-evident truth of a moral framework by saying, well-being is just, that's how it is, and that's therefore how it should be, type thing. People would disagree with his philosophy that he did there. But Richard Carrier has also done some interesting work on that same argument himself, and has probably put it a lot better. So I think one of his essays in one of John Loftus's anthologies really expresses how he gets to a kind of objective morality from how things are. But anyway, yeah.
Because people conflate the word objective and absolute, because objective, absolute, maybe like the divine command theory. There is one right thing to do, and that's it. But we can all agree that this is the right thing to do right now, and that will make it kind of objective.
But it depends how you define objective. If you're defining objective as mind independent, so I talked to you, I laid out the groundwork in the first video on what I believe is the ontology of the universe, which is, I believe in something called conceptual nominalism, which is that concepts don't exist out there, right? They exist in here, and they exist subjectively. And when we all agree on stuff, we write a dictionary. And when we all agree on stuff, we write an encyclopedia and a set of laws. And then we vote people in that hopefully will enshrine those laws into public life. And then, we have police services that will enforce those laws. But if we were all to suddenly die, those laws wouldn't exist, and that morality wouldn't exist out there. So objective morality doesn't exist because it is necessarily conceptual, and concepts and ideas are conceived. They only exist when we conceive of them.
Yeah. I think my idea of objective here, I'm using the colloquial use, which is the consensus.
Yeah. And so that's why it's really important to define what one means by objective. I would generally use a mind independent, and how theists get around this, of course, is by saying, well, it is mind independent from us. It just exists in that mind up there, and that is a necessary being, so it necessarily exists.
I think this is a no question, because when you think of the word morality, you think about agencies and the agencies dealing with each other. There is no evil or goodness in a realm where no sentient agencies dealing with each other to navigate life. It makes no sense to talk about these things in absence of agents that do the suffering or the punishment, or all these engagements have absolutely no meanings in void of humans or void of moral agencies.
And imagine you could. I've not really thought about this before. Hang on, I'm thinking out loud here, so bear with me. But you could imagine, and we were talking about this design sort of stuff a second ago. So you can imagine God could design a world a universe where there wasn't. You didn't need energy to exist, so you didn't need, and so people weren't competing over resources, so you didn't have suffering like that, and so therefore, could you have morality? Like if you had a universe where there was just happened to be no suffering. Like there were no consequences to people's bad actions, therefore invalidating them being bad. So therefore, this kind of leads towards you thinking maybe so objective morality, mind-independent morality, is still dependent upon this world, maybe because of the way this world's structured in a way that makes moral sense, but actually wouldn't make sense in another universe that had a different context. I don't know. I'm going to have to think about that.
No, I think you're onto something there, Jonathan. I completely agree with you. I think this conversation I think morality is predicated upon interactions with moral and agencies. Yeah. Void of that sort of proposition, the word morality itself loses its essence. It's almost like a social construct to navigate, and it's a moving target. What was moral 500 years ago is no longer moral now.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's dependent on consequences to actions as well. If an action had literally no consequence or a completely neutral consequence, then it's hard to imagine how you can have morality. So therefore, in order to have consequences, you have to have interactions. Yeah. So yeah.
And imagine you can still have a consequence and still not touch morality, because you can end up with a consequence in the context of the event. It means that you have to do that, like the train dilemma or trilemma or multiple issues where you might have to deliberately kill one person in order to save many others, and it becomes very dicey a proposition.
Well, of course, that kind of consequentialist theorizing is underwrites. So one of my arguments is God is a consequentialist. I wrote an essay on that years ago, but it now appears, I think it's in that book as well, which is that everything that God does appears to be using consequentialist ethics, which is like when you have Noah's flood, it's like, well, that's a horrible thing to do, kill the entire universe, kill the entire planet of people and animals, bar 8, and 2 of each. They say, oh yeah, but there's a greater good that comes about, like Jesus being sacrificed. That's not very nice. Yeah, but there's a greater good that comes about that. This is pretty horrible. Yeah, there's a greater good that comes about. Okay, well then that is consequentialism, because you are obtaining the moral value from this action by the greater good which it obtains. So therefore that's moral consequentialism. But hang on, theists generally hate moral consequentialism as an ethical system because it doesn't require God. It just requires you evaluating the consequences of a given action. So like William Lane Craig, for example, will call consequentialism a terrible ethic because it's secular. But it appears to be the main ethic that is used in the Bible. So
I agree. I think if there is God is the biggest consequentialist of all. All his actions always predicated on something else, or an expectation of a certain outcome to come as a good thing out of the first action.
Yeah, like the nature of theodicies. Like a theodicy is just literally by definition consequentialist.
Yeah, justice of God. He's he's dealing and wheeling and dealing in order to achieve something bigger out of bits and pieces and smaller stories.
Yeah. So probably the last two arguments we'll deal with today, going back to the free will thing, and I think these are fascinating because irrespective of what you believe about free will, I think these let me see what you think. So God, and I did mention this very briefly last time, which is God has no free will. So remember, God has full divine foreknowledge. God knows about all future events and all counterfactuals and everything, but also God knows about his own future events, which is to say that God has predicted of himself, or knows of himself, what he's going to do in 10 years, 20 years, a million years, right? And also, God is constrained by his own nature, which means that every action that God does is constrained by having to be the most loving, the optimal loving it can be, but also taking into account that he knows everything and that he's the power to do otherwise or whatever. He has omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. So with those characteristics, God's actions are constrained, but then he's got infallible foreknowledge of the future. So if he predicts he's going to make a cup of tea at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, like in 3 months' time, then that is a prediction that is infallible, which means when it comes to 3 months' time, he absolutely has to do that, because if he doesn't do that, it would invalidate his own foreknowledge, which means that God isn't omni-God. So if God is omni-God, God has no free will, because he literally has to do what he knows he's going to do, and God cannot act contrary. He doesn't have the freedom to act contrary to his own like inerring future. So God is just an automaton on these railroad tracks going into the future, and there is no wavering from that course. Literally, he cannot waver from his own predicted future. And I think that's a really interesting thing.
It's basically exactly like us, but with the foreknowledge.
Yeah. His own foreknowledge is what conspires to put him in a straitjacket such that he can't move from doing what he's going to do.
It's almost a curse, because at least you and I, even though we're condemned to do what we're always going to be doing, but because we don't know it yet, it's at least you get that illusion of freedom. He doesn't even have that.
No,
that will drive him insane.
Exactly. And then you start thinking about other things like, so when we talk about, I think conversations about what is rationality are interesting. And again, we touched on this last time, like when we talked about how the universe without time, you couldn't think, right? So God couldn't think causally prior to creating the universe because time wouldn't exist. So there's no temporal like thought processes. But thought processes in and of themselves, when you deliberate on a decision, so you're deciding whether to do X or Y, right? And that's a moral decision. And you're thinking about it. You go, okay, but then what about that? And then so you have a 5-minute conversation with yourself, which is deliberating. But actually, and we say, oh, that's rationality. No, that's inefficient rationality. That's actually really inefficient rationality, because you're kind of like half remembering some things. You're thinking about it for a time, then you're bringing into account this, and then you're like, and you're deliberation is just imperfect rationality. A computer just goes, bish, bash, bosh. There you go. You set out all its programming, its rationality programming, and it goes, bish, bash, bosh, decision made, right? Whereas we go, oh, let's think about that. So God would never deliberate about anything, because that suggests that God wouldn't know the answer straight away and would have to be thinking about stuff to kind of cogitate upon it and come across the right answer. God would know straight away. There would be absolutely no thinking involved. So God is, so the reason I bring that into to play here is because if you think God is like this single automaton on a railroad track, actually God can't even think or spend time thinking. It's just a computer machine that just, there's no deliberation. It's just like answer, or like calculation, most loving, and this is it. Do you know what I mean? It's God is the ultimate divine robot.
That is quite. So, what do you say then to the Noah's flood, where in the Old Testament there's a bit of regretting on God's behalf here when he saw and the infamous rainbow to remind, as a post-it note to remind himself not to kill again.
Of course, you get. I mean, this is going back to God and anatomy. You get all these anthropomorphic stories in the Bible, which is making God look like a human, because this is written by people 2,500 years ago who haven't done all this philosophizing, right? Of like, yeah, God walks among us, God gets angry, God gets jealous, God changes his mind. God couldn't do any of those stuff if you believe in this abstract God. We're going back to this. So you got this God in the Bible that changed his mind at Nineveh, who regrets things, who's jealous, couldn't find Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, all these kind of things. And then you've got the God up here that all of that stuff is impossible for a God up here. And you're like, how do you marry these? Well, you can't. And so you have to say, I mean, I can't disagree or agree. I'm not really sure. Maybe. So I guess, yeah, you realistically, God is a divine robot, and there will be no regretting really no getting jealous, because that's weird, because things like jealousy and anger, also there's arguments you can say these are things that we understand in evolutionary psychology that offer functional benefits because we've evolved them to be beneficial for us to have. So jealousy has a use, anger has a use, happiness has a use, right? But if God doesn't have a body and never went through evolution, all those things that are that we can really only properly understand within their evolutionary paradigm and context don't really apply to God.
Maybe Nick Bostrom's high simulation theory. Maybe he's onto something here.
Yeah, so he says, probabilistically, we're more likely to be living in a simulation than not, and that God could be some. I mean, I guess the idea is, are we just a big game of Sims for God? Or something, I don't know, but certainly God, for me, if God is going to be omni-God, he wouldn't have personhood and he wouldn't have free will. Now, the problem is free will is supposedly a great making property. So when you talk about humans, you say, well, what theists say is a theodicy for explaining why they're suffering. They say, well, there's all this evil on earth because it's humans' fault and that they've got free will, and that's why, and it's a collateral of free will because they make bad decisions. But they say all those bad decisions and all that suffering is worth having because free will is such an important thing. So what they're saying essentially is, in perfect being theology, is that free will is a great making property. It's really good to have free will. Now, the greatest being is God in such a theology. And so therefore, if you're going to have a great making property, God must have free will. If it's a great property, is a great making property, he must have it to the nth degree. And yet, from what we're discussing here, God has it to the 0th degree. Like God just can't have free will, and God just has a necessary nature out of which his entire behavior and actions are determined, and he knows in advance what's going to happen, and there's no deliberating, and there's only calculation, and it's just bosh.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, in some mythologies, especially in the Greek mythologies and other mythologies, the gods have created man, and they start witnessing man exercising the free will that was endowed by gods. And if they start to become jealous of that freedom and the fact that they are not, they can surprise gods and themselves, like by active redemption, active sacrifice, and altruism and things, and gods who cannot deviate from their own nature started to look with jealousy at that agency they've created that exercises more freedom than they can do.
This is a Tower of Babel. The look at them becoming like us, stretching us up to heaven to become like us. And this is another etiological story. This is a perfectly etiological story. Obviously mythological. Of course, we can build higher skyscrapers than that by a country mile these days. So it's a load of rubbish. But they build these ziggurats, and God gets annoyed. In fact, the gods get annoyed. I think, again, it's plural here. They're becoming more like us. So it spreads them all around the world and gives them different languages so they can't work together to speak to each other. What is a function of that story? So the question should always be, when you read biblical stories, is what's the author trying to do here? Don't look at this historically and literally. Like, this isn't a literal story. This is an etiological story. What they're trying to do, they're trying to explain why different people speak different languages. That's all that story is really doing. It's like, well, if everyone came from the same place, from the Garden of Eden and blah, 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 then how come everyone now speaks loads of different languages? Like, so this is something
the other one is
explaining.
Human collaboration is overrated.
Yeah, it's like,
don't do it.
Just
bad idea.
It's like, God, mate, I'm sorry. I know we haven't spoken for a long time, but just to let you know, in case you haven't seen what's happened over the last 2,000 years, we've just flown to the moon and like stood on the moon, right? And you punish people for like building a ziggurat, right? And we've literally flown to the moon and we sent probes out far further. And
it's one of the best things we've ever devised: human collaboration. We come up with crazy cool stuff because of human collaboration.
Why would you punish human collaboration? Oh, it's just ridiculous. Just what a silly story. But it's obviously it's an etiological mythological story, and that's how you should understand it. But no biblical literalists will have it another way. So, and the last argument is that okay, if God doesn't have free will and God is necessary, and this creation out of God you could argue is a necessary creation, just emanates out of God. Just suddenly we pop into existence from God world. And if God knows the future events of all of us and everything on earth, then everything on earth is immutable. So God is immutable and unchanging, but the earth is immutable and unchanging, as in unchanging from what it will be and can be. It can only be one way. And there is no way that anyone can deviate from what God knows will happen. And I think that's really worth dwelling on, because if you believe in divine foreknowledge, the entire universe is just some elaborate set of dominoes that is just falling to exactly how God knows it's going to fall. And then you're like, well, if God knows it's going to fall in exactly this way, infallibly, then why bother doing it if it's going to cause all this pain and suffering? This just looks, you just start going, well, why? What's going on here? You're watching something that you know is going to just topple in.
So, Jonathan, a question for you here. Does foreknowledge here constitute design? Because this is one of the arguments or the counter arguments that come from the theists, that God's foreknowledge does not mean design. He just knows what you're going to be choosing, but he's not actually proactively designing what you're going to be choosing.
Well, this is I don't put a lot of store in these kind of arguments. I find a real problem. It's kind of like I'm watching a DVD, right? And I know it's a film I've watched like 10 times. One of my favorite films. I've watched it 10 times. I know exactly what's going to happen, but I'm not making it happen. I'm just watching it happen, and I know what's going to happen, but I'm not making it happen. But yeah, but that's not a really good analogy, because actually you are God and you've designed the entire universe in which that DVD and blah, 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 blah. So it's like you are creating, if you are designing reality and creating reality, knowing, and before you've created it, you know what's going to happen, in the same way that you know the counterfactuals of all potential universes, and you don't create them, but you do create this one knowing what's going to happen, then even if we are freely doing that stuff, you're still responsible for us freely doing that stuff, because we wouldn't have freely done that stuff if you hadn't have just created this entire universe knowingly in which we are going to do that stuff. But then you get onto what's called the grounding objection, and this is an objection to like middle knowledge and Molinism, which is one way that theists argue that God has knowledge about whatever. But the grounding objection is like, in order for God to know that in this particular causal circumstance, I'm going to do this, right? Which means that in a different causal circumstance, I wouldn't do that. Or in that same causal circumstance, someone else wouldn't do that. To know that I'm going to do that in that causal circumstance means that there must be something that grounds my doing that in that causal circumstance. And this is, of course, where, what we understand about causal determinism, which is like, well, to link my behavior to this particular causal circumstance is to say that this causal circumstance and my own causal circumstance of my genetics and biology in past is grounding all my decisions, which is like the free will debate writ large. So in order for God to know that we are going to do certain things in certain situations, we must have those events grounded in that situation, which is to say they are causally determined. What are they determined by? Well, the entire universe at any given time is determined by the previous instantiation of that universe, which is to say that, well, God designed that universe in that way such that that would happen. Therefore, we're back to God. So there's no way that even with, like, it's the whole idea that God knows what we're going to do, but doesn't make us do that, forgets the fact that God created and designed everything, knowing that we would, that would make sense if you didn't have this whole, well, it could have been any other way. But
your argument, even though the God is not designing every minute of your actions and interactions, but because he's the creator of the blueprint of who you are and the circumstances, it's almost like you're orchestrated to do what you're going to be doing. He does not need to intervene in every little thing, but it's enough that by creating the blueprint, your psyche, the circumstances around you, you're always going to be doing what you're doing. So therefore, he's still a culprit.
Yes, and everything that happens is what God wants. So there's not one thing that takes place, like we talked about last time, stubbing your toe, tsunami. There's not one thing that takes place in this universe that God doesn't want, or at least want because it begets a greater good. So therefore, this is how it is, and this is how God wants it. And if he wanted it any other way, he would have it any other way. Of course, this is arguments against Satan as well. It's like, well, if God wants to get rid of Satan, he could just get rid of Satan like that. He doesn't. Therefore, Satan is God's middle manager. So, God could have created all sorts of different universes, but God created this one. So therefore, we didn't create this one, and God created us and designed us in a way that this is what we do, and God knows that we're going to do it. So yeah, it just gets back to that problem again. And when you talk about it, it's worth having a little sort of think about the sorts of things that I was going to read a list. It's later in the book, actually. I have to find it later. I will read a little quote from page 45 that kind of sums this up. But it also invalidates God's own free will because it cannot act contrary to its own predictions about its own behavior, as I said before. Given that God can only create in a way that fulfills its own omni nature, and given that God can only do one thing, that God has infallibly predicted, and humans can only do one thing, what God has infallibly predicted, then this world must be a set of unerring dominoes falling down in a pattern set out from the outset. Nothing can change. Not God's not God's decisions, not humans' decisions. Nothing about the world or reality from how God imagined and predicted it back at the very beginning. If you're a theist who believes in such a God, just think about that for a while. Consider the ramifications. God is immutable, unchanging, and unchangeable, and so is human behavior and the world at large. Perfectly so. God can't be surprised about it either. The universe is a clockwork machine playing out in the exact manner and to the exact outcomes that it designed and created. Either that, or God doesn't exist, or God is not omni-God.
And therefore not a god.
Yes,
maybe a super being of some sort, but not a god.
Exactly.
Not worship worthy.
Not omni-God. Yeah. And so, as Ray says here, God has designed the universe in such a way that I write a bunch of books against God's existence, and that has to be a net benefit to the world. Because if that is gratuitous suffering, then it wouldn't happen. So therefore, it's a net benefit to the world that I do that. But of course, we're going to get onto another argument, which is moral paralysis that comes out of this same argument, which is that if you see someone being beaten up on the other side of the road, you shouldn't step in to intervene, because actually that's how God's designed it, and there can be no gratuitous suffering. So to stop an old granny getting beaten up, you are stopping a net benefit from taking place. So therefore, and that's a real problem. So it's like there are so many problems with the whole omni-God, but we'll talk about that on another day.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think we've decided that we're going to do sort of allotments of sort of 90 minutes, and today we've just passed that mark. And
I mean, we've got a little bit of time. If there's any questions that anyone in the audience has, I don't know.
You've got some time for us. All right.
Yeah.
Fantastic. We'll open it up.
But are there anything you want to add to anything I've said at all?
No, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, it's almost like, when I read your book, Jonathan, these ideas were floating in my head. Obviously, I've articulated them in such an easy way, and I really recommend people to buy the book or get it as soon as possible, because it's obviously there's a lot of elaboration on what we're talking about, and there are interesting quotes from different areas, but they are very logical. They cannot. I think you've zoned in certain specific areas, and I don't think they can be disputed. Has anybody tried to debate you on the back of that book?
No, and these are arguments I've been saying for a long time, and I've been blogging these or writing columns or presenting them in talks, and like I say, really, just the only way out of so many of these are like skeptical theism, because a lot of them have moral dimensions. Even when you're talking about design arguments, they are moral dimensions. Like God is suboptimally designing, therefore there's causing suffering, therefore it's a problem of evil. So actually, it's amazing how many of these arguments really boil down to the problem of evil, and then the theist just goes skeptical theism. There could be a reason, and that's it. Like I said earlier, and that's generally what you are fighting against. So, and that's frustrating, because I think skeptical theism is just really, really weak.
Yeah.
What I did want to say, like that quote I was going to say about all the causal variables that are acting on a human's life. Here's just a nice list. Okay, so here are the things that will dictate how we act in a given situation. So one, being born, our genetic inheritance, our life in the womb, shaping our genetic self, the time and place of birth, parents, relatives, race and gender, nurture and experience in infancy and childhood, the mutations in our brains, the body throughout our life, other purely random events take place to us. Our natural physical stature, looks, smile and voice, intelligence, sexual drive and proclivities, personality and wit, natural ability in sports, music and dance, our religious training, economic circumstances, cultural influences, political and civil rights, the prevailing customs of our times, and the blizzard of experiences throughout life, not chosen by us, but which happen to us, all the molecules, particles, forces and wave functions, the entire environment. So basically you add all that together, that is acting upon you making a decision at any one time. And of course, at that time, you have no control over any of those things. Those things are now outside of your control, but they are informing how you act. So I just think, it's worth understanding the sort of determining factors in how we act. And of course, then when you think God knows all of that in advance, then, there you go.
What was the number of that last argument? Was that number 6 or so?
Yeah, we've really not got very far, have we? I think that was number 9.
Oh, that's not too bad.
So the next set of arguments are on epistemology. Well, why not quite epistemology? Why we believe or not. So talking about sort of a bit of psychology at the beginning, but also the belief factor in God and how God is unfair. So arguments to do with, say, why is it that certain people are more likely to believe in God than other people? And how is that fair? And it looks,
in my opinion, this is probably the strongest. And I think as we get to know more about the neurology of the humans, and I think we're going to find out. And I actually think that throughout our evolution, it was something that we needed. We needed to believe in order to survive. And it was good for quite some time, but I think it's becoming an obstacle at this point.
Yeah, so this is I think there's a couple of things going on here. You're absolutely right. So the God belief provides functional benefits, and that's why it exists. The question is, why does it still exist, and can we provide those functional benefits in other ways that are better, or in secular ways? Or can we get rid of some of those functions that we actually don't need those functions anymore? God used to provide explanatory functions for us, why things happen. Okay, God belief, or at least religion, active kind of social religion, provides social functions for us: network, church, friendship, support, all these things. So how can we provide those communities instead of doing it through church and God belief, so on and so forth. So we need to understand what those functions are that have come out through the evolution of us. But it's also worth looking at psychologists, right? As a branch of science, psychologists are the scientists who have the least belief in God, and I always find that really fascinating, because it's when you start understanding why other people believe things, you realize it's not often about the content. So it's about the function. Again, like we just talked about, it's not the content of belief that's so persuasive. It's the fact that this belief, it gets me to heaven, so it makes me feel good. It makes me understand the world, and it gives me social benefits and all this. So when a psychologist understands why people believe all sorts of different things, why people believe political viewpoints, as an understanding of your neurological pathways and your political psychology, then you're unpicking the mechanisms that get you to believe. It's no wonder that psychologists themselves have the lowest belief in God.
Yeah, I mean, you probably finished with that. You and I would agree that you and I, being atheists, if we turn up in a funeral, we'll struggle a bit because of we won't have the vocabulary. And what's more consoling than, your little daughter who is 3 years old and sort of drowned in an accident, you're going to be reunited with the daughter, and you're going to live happily ever after. I mean, how do you compete with that?
That's such a good point. Have you seen Midnight Mass?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so it's a Netflix series, really good series, written by a guy who was an ex-Catholic, and so basically the whole of Midnight Mass is basically a theological exposition, and it's really an atheistic exposition. It's a fascinating, lots of long dialogue as well as being a horror thing, but it's not really about the horror. It's about some of these big chunky dialogues which are phenomenal. And the last scene, so there are two key scenes in that. One scene where she's talking about losing her baby, one of the main characters, and she talks about heaven is like her being the potential of who she could have been, this perfect version of herself, and being reunited with family and all this. So she's like imagined. So this is like people make up heaven to fit what they really want it to be. This very comforting thing, like you said. We can't compete as atheists. Like it's just we can't say that you're going to be living in.
I think there was a scene from one of my favorite comedian is actually an Englishman, Ricky Gervais, and the sitcom was called Extras.
Yeah,
and he's running around trying to get a token line because he's a silent sort of extra somewhere as a fifth seaman from the right, and that girl with the disability comes along with her sister. He wants to date the sister, so he pretends to be religious. And the disabled girl comes along and sort of staggering, and he first cracks a joke about having too much to drink and then realizing that she was disabled in front of her sister after he sort of embarrassed himself. But then she starts talking about heaven, and she's gonna, how she's gonna be perfect in next life, and he starts saying he's an atheist, is supposed to be an atheist, and he was talking about how she's gonna be playing volleyball in heaven, and she would be like floating around, and just to and they're turning up in church and not knowing how to pray and such, and for the girl just to eventually realize that he was just trying to get into her pants by pretending to be religious. But that's exactly what you were saying. That religious people will always try to compensate for their shortcomings in life. Say, this is how I'm going to become in heaven.
So in Midnight Mass, there's that scene where she says that, but then right at the end, I don't want to give it away, or I'm going to give a bit of a spoiler here, but right at the end, the very last scene, well, one of the very last scenes is basically her dying. And then she gives an atheistic expression of death. So there's this difference between what she had said earlier and there. And it is one of the best bit. I like again. I wrote a really long piece on this on Only Sky on Midnight Mass about how, and that speech is just absolutely phenomenal. But anyway, so yeah, that's a really good, understanding of like how we can cope with death as atheists and explain it in a kind of cosmic way. But I love going back to Ricky Gervais. You'll find that pretty much everything he writes really is an excuse to have a go at God. So even if it's Afterlife or Extras, he'll write some great comedy and stuff, but like littered throughout, he's just itching to have a go at God somewhere. And he gets it in.
Big fan. He's quite witty. He's a very smart man. He does. Even from the beginning, from The Office all the way to his Afterlife's brilliant. And I like the fact he doesn't sort of dwell. It's always 2 seasons and maybe a special, like a Christmas special that he does. He's brilliant. But Jonathan, as ever, I've enjoyed the conversation. Next part is going to be quite interesting because we're going to delve into the psychology of humanity. And I think this is where religion dwells, to be honest, and where God dwells.
I mean, and we'll be talking about like the how God, actually most of the next arguments will be about how God is unfair in terms of why people believe and how people believe. But yeah, for sure. Looking forward to it.
Great stuff. Well, thank you so much, folks. Well, probably in a fortnight again, we will have the part 3. And until then, enjoy the rest of the weekend.